Good afternoon, good morning, maybe, good evening. Welcome to this Fleet Forum webinar. I hope that you can hear me and that you can see me okay. If some of you can sort of let me know if you can see me, hear me, that would be good. Yeah, all good. So super. So we have a lot of participants today, or at least a lot of people that have registered for this webinar. It's going to be a longer webinar than usual, because what we would like to do is take you through our new Clean Fleet Toolkit that we are in the process of updating, and I'm able today to sort of take you to our demo version and show you what it is all about. I will give it another minute to allow people to join in. In the meantime, feel free to use the chat box to say hi to the colleagues on the call, to introduce yourself. For those of you who have been in our webinars before, you sort of know the drill, like introduce yourself, which organization, where are you based, and then I'll give it another, like I said, I give it another second for people to join in. Second, maybe minute, because we want to give everybody the opportunity to participate in this webinar. And I see a lot of familiar names, so that's cool. And hopefully also a lot of new names that are joining. Okay, we have an hour today, or we have allocated an hour. If we finish earlier, then that's fine as well. But in total, we have 60 minutes to explain to you about the new Clean Fleet Toolkit, and to also take you through. Now, last week we had our Fleet Forum conference, and we also did a session there. Where we started to explain around the toolkit, from the idea of we need to start collecting data around our emissions, because if we don't know where we are, if we don't know what our baseline is in terms of emissions, we cannot progress, we cannot make improvements, and actually we cannot move forward. So that's the start of this webinar. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Roos van Stijn, and I'm the Development Director with Fleet Forum. I have enabled the Q&A mode, so if you have any question related to the information that I'm providing, or later on when we are looking at the toolkit, just use the chat box. You see a little question mark icon next to the chat. If you click on that, then your comment or your question will be listed as a question, and I will be able to pick it up later at the end of this session. What I'm gonna do is, because I don't know how many of you were in the session that we did at the conference, I'm gonna just briefly explain to you a little bit around the reasons why we are updating the new Clean Fleet Toolkit. So maybe a question to you, and just use the chat to let me know. How many of you are familiar with our the current Clean Fleet Toolkit? So how many of you have used that either in one of our trainings, or because you were at the knowledge platform? How many of you have already used your data to identify what the emissions of your current emissions of your fleet were? So John says, I've used it a few weeks ago. I see that Sam is typing, and I remember, Sam, I think already in 2008 that you were using the Clean Fleet Toolkit. So that's, I hope, yes, 2008. So, okay, so for those of you who might not be familiar with the Clean Fleet Toolkit, it is a toolkit that was developed already a long time ago. And it was basically developed initially by UNEP and by TNT, and it is a tool that you can use as a fleet manager to calculate in a very simple way your emissions. But that's going to change. And why? Why do we want to change it? Well, we want to change it because the visibility of carbon footprints is key. In many organizations, aid and development organizations, but also commercial fleet operators, it is important to know what your emissions are from the work that you do. And you see a lot of initiatives in the sector, in the aid and development sector, that are looking at that. So a couple of, last year, the Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations was introduced. And from that, there was also an introduction of the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator, because organizations need to get an idea, insight in the emissions that they cause, because they are operating, and we need to include everything. From there also to, of course, then start reducing the emissions. There's a lot of organizations that are having charters now where they say, oh, by 2030 we want to reduce our emissions, or we want to become carbon neutral or net zero. So there are a lot of initiatives already in the sector. Now, what we also learned last week during the Fleet Forum conference is that only 38% of our community, so 38% of the fleet managers community, the Fleet Forum community, have a baseline for fleet emissions. We asked this question last week, and what you see here is that 38% of the fleet managers do have the baseline. So there is still a lot of improvement for the rest of the community to start getting insight in their fleet emissions. Now, like I said, Fleet Forum had developed already, or not specifically Fleet Forum, but UNEP and TNT in 2006. Developed a Clean Fleet Toolkit. And what you see here is a very it's an old-fashioned picture of what the initial original toolkit looked like. It is an Excel-based toolkit. It is simple, it is user-friendly, and it used very basic data, like number of vehicles and fuel consumption. I see that people have some network issues. Maybe if you are having network issues, maybe the best thing is for you to just log in and log out. That's probably how you can solve it. So the Clean Fleet Toolkit originally developed in 2006, and very simple, very basic data. So we started to use this to also help Fleet Forum organizations to get insight in their emissions. And in 2017, UNEP and Fleet Forum, we took it on ourselves to revamp it. So to put it online as an online-based calculator, to include generators, as that was a desire from many of our members, but also to use updated emissions, and then making the next steps to make it available in French with the use of Google Translate. So that's where we basically are now. This is the toolkit that we have, and now we thought, like, okay, we need to revamp it, we need to update it again, because our toolkit, and this is also what many organizations are focusing on, is only looking at Scope 1 fleet emissions. And I will explain a little bit of the difference between Scope 1 and Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions in a while. But many organizations are currently only focused on Scope 1 fleet emissions, and that is not enough. So we wanted to support organizations to get a better, broader insight in all the emissions that are produced with operating their fleet. And that is also in line with the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator. So the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator looks at the complete supply chain. So look at all the elements that are related to operations of humanitarian organizations, And fleet is a big part of that. So we wanted to update our Clean Fleet tool to say, okay, well, if organizations are also using the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator, that the calculations and the emissions, that they are aligned, so that if you're working in the field, that you can use the Fleet Forum tool. But then if your colleagues at the global level, maybe your sustainability colleagues, that they can then take your information and input that into the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator. So that was our starting point, where we said, okay, don't try to avoid that we have multiple different tools, multiple different emission factors, multiple different calculation methods. So as much as possible, align it with the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator. And also, the other requirement that we had, and that was an important one for us, is that we wanted to be more future thinking or forward thinking, that we said, okay, it is no longer enough for us to only look at scope 1 emissions. We need, as a sector, we need to take our responsibility, and we also need to include and get an idea of what are our scope 2 and what are our scope 3 emissions. So now, what are scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions? So what you see here, and I realize that the visual might not be very, very good readable, but I will explain the different scopes in a minute. But basically, the scope 1, 2, and 3 is that you have different emissions that are impacting you. So what you see in the middle, and that is your scope 1, are all your direct emissions. Those are the emissions that come from the work the operation that you have, the work that you do, the buildings that you own, the vehicles that you own. These are your scope 1 direct emissions. Now, upstream activities, so everything that is needed to make sure that your organization can do the work that it does, are in your indirect scope 3 emissions, or in your indirect scope 2 emissions. And again, I will explain a bit more in detail what that is. But also downstream, you have scope 3 emissions. So now let's look at them a little bit more in detail. So scope 1 are the emissions directly emitted by the organization. So for example, if your organization uses your own diesel generators because you're in a field location, or you are in a location where the grid, the electricity grid, is not reliable, and you have diesel generators as a backup to make sure that you can do your work, that is your scope 1. These are directly emitted by the organization. Now also, if you use your own vehicles, if you procure your vehicles, then the use of these vehicles, these are your scope 1 emissions. Now, scope 2 are the emissions that are resulting from the electricity that you purchase and consume. Now, think, for example, if you are in your office and you turn on the light, that is a scope 2 emission. So everything that has to do with electricity and electricity from the grid, that is your scope 2 emissions. So for those of you who might operate electric vehicles, and if you charge them from the grid, so you plug them in and you get your electricity from the grid, then that is your scope 2 emission. And then, of course, is scope 3. Scope 3 are all the other indirect emissions resulting from the organization's activities. So if you are purchasing goods, relief goods, if you are purchasing materials that you need, that you are bringing to communities, these are scope 3 emissions. If you are outsourcing your last mile transportation to a local transport company, that is a scope 3 emission. But you can also think about staff that are commuting from and to the office every day. that's also indirect emissions that are resulting from your organization's activities, because your people need to come to the office in order for your organization to do their work. And that's why we want to include, or we have to include them into our scope 3 emissions. So I hope that that makes sense. And I hope, I mean, probably sometimes we mix them up, like what is scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. But I hope this explanation makes sense. Now, then, what is it that we have changed? So, looking at the Clean Fleet Toolkit as we have it now, we looked at local air pollutants, and we looked only at the CO2 emissions in scope 1. So we looked at fuel consumed by owned and rented ICE vehicles. Yes, in the 2017 update, we also included electricity, but we did not look at, okay, so how is that then impacting the emissions in scope 2? So everything that the current toolkit does is it reports on scope 1 emissions. Now, the new updated toolkit, it still, of course, looks at local air pollutants. It also, we didn't take out the scope 1, so it still looks at the fuel consumed by owned and rented ICE vehicles, but we are also including the electricity purchased to power your own and rented hybrid and electric vehicles. And what we are doing is that we are now including scope 3. So we also look at the production of the vehicle. We have included an emission factor for that. We are looking at fuel and electricity. We are looking at insurance services. We are looking at maintenance. We have included waste. So how much vehicle or fleet waste do you have? And I will show it to you in a second. So gradually we are including more things to give you a better and a much more broader overview of the emissions that your organization is producing. Now, what is pending and what is on our list to include as well is the full emissions that are related to the production of an electric vehicle. We want to look at cargo transportation. So if we are putting goods into the trucks, whether that is owned or rented, so how much emissions are involved there, but also looking at business travel / employee commuting. So that means that if you are taking your own vehicle to come from your house and to the office, that in the second iteration of the Clean Fleet Toolkit, in the second iteration, then you will also be able to key that in. So these are sort of the new things in the Clean Fleet Toolkit. Now, let me look at the changes. What I will do is I will stop this presentation, and then it takes me 2 seconds to switch to the screen sharing, so I can show you what it looks like. It always takes a while for that to happen. And I think you can see my screen right now, right? If somebody can just confirm that, that would be great. If that is the case. Yes, super. Okay. Now, okay. So from the entry screen of the Clean Fleet Toolkit, nothing has changed. So you still have your introduction screen. We will give you some advice, especially for those of you who have not used the Clean Fleet Toolkit before. So step 1 is to fill in the data. Of course, you need to collect your data. Then from the data that you fill, you will have the emissions of your fleet, and then you can view your options. Now, before we go completely in, I'm just going to make a quick refresh so that I know that I have the latest version. So from the introduction screen, we can go to the inventory. Now, what is new here is that you can select your country. So, and the reason why that is that from the resources that we use, there are specific emission factors per country, especially when it comes to scope 2 emissions, the electricity that you use. Because you can imagine that if you are working in a country like Kenya, where the electricity is produced a lot with from renewable resources, from solar or from wind, that is a completely different emission factor than if we have electricity produced from what we call a dirty grid. So that's why we ask you now to mandatory key in your country, and you can either select that from the drop-down list as you see here, or you can just key it in and then you will get it. Now, the diesel sulfur levels, that's still the same. So that's the level of diesel sulfur in your that's the level of sulfur in your diesel. And we have a short guide here where you can find the levels for your specific country. Now, I'm gonna name my fleet Rose. And I then also can select the currency. And why is that important? Because we are including the emissions from your rental vehicles, and we are including emissions from your maintenance costs and your insurance costs. And these emission factors are based on currency. Now, you might say like, oh well, but if I'm operating in Kenya, then Kenya shilling is my currency, and we can sort of make that already pre-filled. But a lot of the organizations, even though they are working in specific countries, they are still reporting. They are still reporting in US dollars or maybe euros. So that's why we made it like that. So I'm going to report in US dollars. Then I can, nothing changed here. I can still key in the petrol price and the diesel price. We had that in the previous version of the toolkit as well. And then I can key in the electricity price. Now, what we see here, the approximate electricity from fossil fuels, from renewable sources, that is information that you can normally find on the internet for your specific country. So let's say for Kenya, the percentage that comes from fossil fuels might be low, maybe 20%, and then the remaining is 80% that comes from renewable resources. So that's what you can then fill in. And here I can key in what I pay every year. And of course, I'm making stuff up. So you can fill in, and this is new, what are the annual rental costs in your fleet of your rental vehicles, what are the maintenance costs, and what are the insurance costs. Every now and then I am just checking the chat because now I'm screen sharing and I cannot see that. So this is sort of you starting your inventory sheet, and you can fill it in. So what is new here is the country, filling it in is mandatory. The currency, you have to fill it in. And then these last three, the rental cost, the maintenance cost, and the insurance cost. That is what we added because that is what is also determining our scope 3 emissions. And then I can start filling it. Now, what you see here is all the types of vehicles that we have. So you see a long list here with the passenger cars, the diesel cars, electric cars, etc., etc. That is not different from what we had before. What is different is that we made a split between owned and rented, what you see here. So you can say, oh, well, I've got 10 owned vehicles and I've got 20 rented vehicles. And then what is similar to the previous what is similar to the previous toolkit, or the one that we have right now, is that you can fill your total mileage. So let's do that. Let me make it a little bit. Okay, and the total fuel consumption. Okay. So, and you can do this for every type of vehicle that you have. So what I did right now is here I filled it in for the passenger cars, the gasoline, but you can work your way through every type of vehicle that you have. And here what you see is also use it for motorcycles and generators. Now, what you also see here is that we, for those of you who have the Clean Fleet Toolkit before, is you might remember that previously we always had some guidance on year of manufacturing related to the Euro classification. So we took that out because what we noticed was that it was sometimes confusing. It was very much based on Euro classification and year of manufacturing in Europe. So what we did right now is we say, okay, let's just work with the Euro 1, Euro 2, Euro 3, and just leave it like that. And you working in the areas that you work and knowing what kind of vehicles you are purchasing or renting, you should actually know what the classifications are. So the big difference here is, or the new thing is here, that you can choose between owned and rented, and that you can key that in. So let me also add some a little bit vehicles that we have. Let me see. Let me make that a little bit lower. So, hopla. And again, I'm making this up, so don't hold me to it. And of course, what we will then do is that we have total fleet inputs, which can then take us to the next slide, where we can look at the emissions. Now, one thing I want to point out is that here we have a new category, and the category is waste. And that is a new one, because what we do see more and more is that organizations are interested in calculating the emissions from waste, and it is important as well. It's one thing to look at, okay, how much emissions do we have when we are operating the vehicles, but also in terms of what we are producing, because we have to change the oil, because we are changing the tires, because we are changing the batteries of our vehicles after a while. That is also important to calculate. Now, for this one, for the waste, what is important to say is that we do have very little validated data around this. So what we are using right now is based on data from ICRC, but when we have more research data, we will update the emission factors behind it. But basically what you can do is, from your maintenance sheets, you can say, okay, well, over a year, we had so many liters of lubricants that we changed. We had so many tires that we changed, and we had so many batteries. Now, this is important because it will sort of go into your emission factors. And ultimately, what you can then also start doing is say, okay, how can we reduce that? Do we need to extend the life of the tire? Do we need to extend the life of well, do we need to do fewer oil changes? Is that possible? Can we still then operate? So these are reasons why we want to do, and also because, of course, it is part of your emissions, and we need to start calculating data around it. So again, I'm making things up. I love making things up, and hopla. So once you have inserted all this information, then finally you can go to your emissions. And now hopefully hopefully it works. So what you will get, and I have to go back because there was a little hiccup here in my internet. What you will get, and this is similar as what we did before, is that you get an overview of your emissions. So you will see like, okay, so these were the number of vehicles that you have, the distance, and then this is new. You see scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and then you see all the other emissions related to your fleet. And then you will see the charts, and you will see the total CO2, the CO2 per kilometer, the CO2 of your fuel use. So if you just give me 1 second, I will go back. And do a quick, and hopefully my internet is okay. I'm just okay, and I'm gonna just do it for I'm just gonna do it for one category, and I will include some waste. And now, hopefully, fingers crossed. Yeah, so it worked. Of course, the graphs are not because I only did it for one specific vehicle type and for a little bit of waste. But what you see here, and I hope you can read it, up on the top it says scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and here you get the emissions from that. So it gives you much better insight in where do I have the bulk of my emissions, because it then also gives you insight in, okay, where can I start making improvements? So is it in my scope 3 or scope 1 or scope 2 emissions? Then what we will do is what you will see here is per vehicle type. You will have your emissions and then also your waste. So what you see here, and again, the data that I used was completely fake. But what you see here is that based on this data, you would have well, your biggest, let's say, your biggest challenge lies in the emissions of your waste. Then you will get an overview here of what the total is. Then infinity, I think we need to look at that. So there's an infinitive CO2 per kilometer, but we will give you information about the CO2 per kilometer driven based on the data that you are based on the data that you keyed in. And then what we are looking at right now is because in the Clean Fleet Toolkit, we always had recommended actions. Some of you might know that we are also working hard on another project related to a Green Me Toolkit, where also we discuss recommended actions. So we might want to merge these two. So it could well be that these recommended actions will be taken out of the Clean Fleet Toolkit. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing and see if there are, let me see, stop sharing. Let me see. I'm gonna ask if there are any questions. Yeah, that's what I'm gonna do. And I see that we have questions, so let me put this one on Q&A mode so that I can also... Okay, Carlos is asking, are there minimum data quality requirements organizations should comply with in order to get reliable information? Well, so last week during the conference, you heard us say a lot of times, like, we know that data quality is an issue. Of course, the better, the cleaner your data is, the better it is. That's always the case. But what we also need to realize is that we need to start somewhere. So yes, of course, if you have good quality data, it's clean, there are no outliers, it is checked whether well, what is in your data, that it is also the correct data. That's the better that is, because then you get more reliable results. Now, if you know that you have data quality issues, then what we would advise is that you take a sample of your data, use that as a baseline, maybe extrapolate that for your global fleet or for your country fleet, so that you have that baseline and then work from there. So two things can happen. So either when you start working on your data quality, you will see that over time your baseline will change. So that could happen, or the other way around, where you say, okay, well, I know that I have a quality issue. I will do a baseline now. I will see what the status is, and then I will work from there. Now, the information that you need to have is, of course, insight in the number of owned vehicles, rented vehicles, fuel used, kilometers driven, and then the additional information around, well, what is the fuel price, what is the energy sources, so how much comes from renewable resources, how much comes from the grid. But that's, I would say, is basic data. What we try to do, and that was also at request of our members, is to add add scope 2 and scope 3 emissions calculations in the toolkit, but at the same time keep it as simple as we could, so that it doesn't become a very complicated, that it doesn't that you don't need a lot of additional data. But basically, I would say every fleet manager in a country office should have this data. The only thing that you might need to start looking into is start to collect data around the waste that you are producing from the operation of your vehicles. So that's mainly that's the answer to that question. Is biodiesel consumption taken into consideration in the toolkit? Good question. And the answer to that is, I am not sure. I don't think so, because it doesn't. It's not stated in the inventory, sort of in the first sheet, in the inventory sheet. And also, if I look at the diesel, if I look at the inventory sheet where it says passenger vehicles, it says petrol, diesel, trucks, petrol, diesel. Good one. I will note it down, and we will probably look into it in a next iteration, if there's a lot of members that are saying, oh, we are using biodiesel. So that's the answer. How does rented vehicles impact emission calculation versus owned vehicles? Thanks for the question, Endo. So basically, rented vehicles are impacting. So rented vehicles are part of your total emissions calculation. And what we saw previously is that organizations are looking at their own fleet in a lot of cases. So that's why we wanted to include rental. And also, rented vehicles fall in a different emission category. And it is important to realize that, because you can imagine that scope 1 emissions. Remember, scope 1, the emissions that are produced by your organization. So that's the emissions from your own vehicles. Um, uh, you have control over them. You can decide, oh, I'm gonna use smaller vehicles. You can decide, oh, I'm gonna increase the passenger rate. You can decide, oh, I'm gonna stick to the I'm gonna change my diesel vehicles or petrol vehicles for hybrid vehicles. So there, your level of control is much higher. So scope 1 is fully under your control. You can make decisions around that. Now scope 3 are things that are you use them to operate your organization, but your level of control is less. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean like, oh, we don't have control and that's where we are not going to do anything. No, it means that you as a fleet manager or your organization needs to do much more to work with your rental companies to make sure that the emissions from these vehicles are gradually going gradually going down as well, right? Because you need to look at, okay, instead of renting very old vehicles, we want to put in place criteria in our procurement process where you say, oh, at the minimum we want to have these vehicles, or you say, well, if these vehicles also come with drivers, then we want at least that these drivers are trained doing eco driving. So these are things that you then need to start thinking about. Now the good news is that your scope 3 emissions are scope 1 emissions for the rental company. So there is a relation and you both have a benefit and an interest to reduce these emissions as well. I hope that that answers the questions, Ando. The question, Ando. Let me see. Semasa asks, since we have no control of rented vehicle maintenance, how can this type of vehicles impact our CO2 in our organization? How are we responsible? Ooh la la, yes, you are responsible. And it goes back to what I was explaining just on the question that Ando was asking. So I want to, first of all, I want to say that as an organization, and especially if you are well, working for a large international organization, you do have control over rented, you do have a level of control over rented vehicle maintenance. And you can do that by putting criteria into your procurement processes so that you know that when you go out to rent vehicles, that they should follow a maintenance schedule, just like you do with your own fleet. You have also the responsibility to check if this maintenance is done. So there is quite a lot of responsibility with the organization. Now you also, and your efforts to get control over this and your efforts to work with your rental provider to lower these, well, to make sure that they follow the maintenance process and in turn lower the emissions, that needs time, it needs attention, and it is probably much more work than it is what you have to do with your scope 1 emissions. But yes, you are responsible. Also, and for those of you who were in the Fleet Forum conference and following the session from DG ECHO, one of the European donor, also because donor organizations are using how sustainable you are working in scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 as a license to operate. So in future, your funding can be depending on how you manage your emissions and how sustainable you are as an organization, including all the activities that you outsource, like maintenance, like rented vehicles, like repair services. So you need to get a grip on that, and that starts with getting a baseline and getting insight. Is there an option to download the result into an MS document? Thanks, Boyo, for your question. So what you can do in the Clean Fleet Toolkit, you could already do that. You could save your changes if you are working for a Fleet Forum member organization, and then you can export them as well. So that we are not going to change that. So it is possible to export. That. Um, okay, yeah, Vera, yeah, good question. So, of course, your fuel price, your petrol price, that will change throughout the year. So, what we do advise is, if you do your baseline, let's say that you want to do a baseline now, we do advise to take a year of data. So, a full year of all your kilometers driven, of um, a full year of your fuel used, and then take the average of your fuel price over the year. Now you might say like, oh yeah, but sometimes we have spikes and we have this. Yes, but if you do that now for the full year of 2022, and you set your baseline with that data, and now let's say that in January 2024, you do another calculation using a similar average, you're using the average of your fuel price from 2023, then you weigh that out. So that's what we would recommend. Tesfai, while Toyota emission standard levels are classified based on the emission. Let me read that again. While Toyota emission standard levels are classified based on the emission reduction technologies installed in the vehicles, the Euro emission standard classification uses production year intervals. Which one should we adopt, and should we do so? Yeah, so that's why that was what I was explaining. So previously, if you might remember, in the Clean Fleet Toolkit, we did say like, okay, if you are Euro 1, then using the Euro emission standard classification, your vehicle is probably produced in this and this year. And we did that to guide people who did not know what the Euro emission standard was. Now, exactly for the reason what you are writing there is, that's why we took out the production year intervals. I would say that you should look at the emission standard level. So yeah, I would say that you would take the one, because we know that for some markets the emission standards are different, right? So use the one that you get from the manufacturer and use them. So until we have a better solution, until we have like well, hopefully a global standard classification. That would be my answer. I hope that makes sense. Let me see, because if there's more question. Yeah, no, I agree, Tesfai, and that's our concern as well. Even vehicles, and that's what we saw recently. With for some markets, the manufacturers the vehicle can be brand new, it can be produced yesterday, but still it has pre-Euro standards. So the only thing, well, what I can say is, if you get rid of the classification based on years, but really look at, okay, what is the standard, the Euro standard that we want to operate. And I know that especially in the East African region, the governments are now also putting up and increasing the Euro standard. So, for example, in Kenya, there's now a standard. I think also in Ethiopia, that you cannot import pre-Euro or Euro 0 vehicles anymore, and we applaud that, of course. But then you have to go with what the organization or what the manufacturer is saying. Yeah, I hope that that answers the question. Let me see. I see another one. Let me see. Different markets could have different standards. Yeah, for instance, North American produced vehicles might have different emission requirements than Euro standards. Is there any type of equivalency? I don't think so. I will look into it and can let you guys know, but I don't think so. I think as organizations, as international organizations, we also should take responsibility and say, oh, well, we want to have these standards, and whether we call it Euro standards or whether we call it, well, North American standards, but we want to have standards, or we want to have the vehicles that emit the lowest emissions and that we can operate in the environments that we work in. So, because that goes hand in hand, right? I have to say, personally, I was very disappointed when the government in Kenya announced that that the standard would be raised. The response of some international organization was to order more just before, let's say, the bar was raised, which I think is not a good signal. It is also not showing a sign of taking responsibility. But I think as organizations, you do have a responsibility to say, okay, we want to use the vehicles that are that we can order, that we can operate, and that have the lowest emissions in the countries. To do that. If the country being considered is chosen, is it not possible to have the data appear in the general information sector? Not quite sure, Tesfaye, what you mean with that. If you could use the chat maybe to explain a little bit better what you mean. So yeah, then I'll wait for that and I'll pick it up later. I see that more people are typing. Yeah. Oh, and I see a good one from Tanveer, and Tanveer, you're absolutely right. So used spare parts is still missing in waste calculation. Yes, and the way we see it is that I hope, and I hope you agree with me, what we did is we made a step up in the Clean Fleet Toolkit, going from scope 1. Remember, only your own vehicles and only based on the operating life, including more. So looking at you owned and rental, including maintenance, insurance. We are not done yet, and the reason why we have to make decisions not to include things at the moment, and there's more things as well, is because we don't have good data. We don't have good resource data what the emission factor is. So we are closely working with the people from the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator to see if we can find reliable data, if we can find accepted data around specific emission factors, and used spare parts is one of them. The other one, which we also would like to have good data around, is the emission factors of the production of electric vehicles, electric and hybrid vehicles. But also, what are the emissions of your disposal? Meaning that if you are, after 5 years, if your organization is done with the vehicle and you sell it, you donate it, and it is used maybe in a second life or maybe a third life or 10th life, what are the emission factors related to that? And at the moment we don't have good data. Doesn't mean that in future that we will add that. Now, if any of you comes across good, reliable data around this, so things that are still missing in the in the Clean Fleet Toolkit, let us know, because that's well, together we can sort of improve and make steps towards a full, let's say, emission calculation of the full life cycle of the vehicles and the motorcycles, and etc. etc. Let me see. Tanveer, yeah. To get the electric price, the percentage of that's fine. Yes, yeah. So we did not do that, because if we want to do that, then we wanted to keep this as simple as we could, but also from our side to keep it as low maintenance as we could. So if we as Fleet Forum need to check on electricity prices, on the diesel sulfurs that are in specific countries, and we need to do that for all the countries where our members are operating, and that's not one country or not one region, I can assure you that. Then we either need somebody full-time to update it, or we need to make the Clean Fleet Toolkit in such a way that it relies on a lot of external databases. And well, that doesn't well, it's always possible, but yeah, it requires funding, it requires people working on it, and it requires also checking of these databases if they are not outdated. So we decided, no, every fleet manager, everybody in organizations, you have your own responsibility to look at it, and then fill it in. So that's why we did it. I hope you can appreciate that. I'm gonna see if there's more questions. I see Carlos will quote me. Well, I'm always happy to read that. Let me see. Okay, so Vera, thanks. Yeah, how do you generate the electricity price when you do not use either hybrid or electric vehicle? Then if you are not using any hybrid or electric vehicle, then of course you're not filling it in. So or it's not necessary to fill it in. So that's it. We have 3 minutes on the clock. So to conclude, well, I really recommend that as a fleet manager, that you are gradually moving from calculating not only your scope 1, but also your scope 2 and your scope 3. No, what is important are some of the messages that I said, is like, okay, the Clean Fleet Toolkit will remain work in progress. We really hope that you appreciate the step up that we are making by including more emission factors and more activities and items related, but also know that we will continue to update in the near future. If you have good data sources around emission factors of spare parts, of electric vehicles, let us know. And then my last question to you before we close off is, so we have the Clean Fleet Toolkit. It is almost ready, but we would like to test, and we would like to test with a small number of people. We are thinking about, let's say, 8 to 10 people who are going to use their data and who are going to see, okay, how does it work? Does it make sense? Is it logical? Do you want to see other graphs than we have right now? So if you are interested, and if you say yes to this, if you sign up for this, then know that we will have a session with you to go step by step, so you can test it first. You can play with it, you can try to rip it apart, and then we will schedule a meeting with you to discuss, because for us it is important to get feedback on this, so that we make sure that what we produce ultimately is what you what is useful to you. So if you want that, I put my name on the slide. So make screenshots, write it down, scribble it in your notes, send me an email, and then we will reach out to you. Like I said, we are not looking for 50 people or 100 people. If we have a test panel, let's say, of max 10 people, we would be really, really happy. So it is also a bit of first one comes, first one serves, or the other way around. And with that, I would like to thank you. I hope you found this useful. I would like to wish you a very pleasant rest of the day, and I hope to receive. I hope to receive your emails soon. Um, Thanks a lot, and hope to see you next time in one of our next webinars. Thank you. Bye bye.